This tutorial is for people who work in Adobe Premiere Pro and want to make Google Earth Studio movies look more cinematic and more realistic without going to a dedicated visual effects program such as Blender. What you're seeing right now are tests I did for the opening sequences of a series I'm producing for KCTV in Seattle, Washington. I'm experimenting here with relatively simple techniques in Premiere to make Google Earth clips look a bit more cinematic and a little more fun to watch. In this tutorial, I assume that you already know how to create a basic flyover movie in Google Earth Studio. If you don't, I suggest you first learn how to do that by watching one of the many tutorials on YouTube, such as my own, which is linked at the end of this video that you're watching right now. Let's start by looking at one of the sequences I created in Google Earth Studio before I enhanced it in Premiere. I think it looks pretty good, but as one of my students commented, Google Earth movies tend to look more like screen captures from video games rather than real movies. I agree, and I think there are three main reasons for this. First of all, images straight from Google Earth Studio can look a bit dull and washed out, so we can do some basic color grading. Second, the depth of field in Google Earth is infinite, meaning that everything is in sharp focus. In photographs and movies, we usually prefer shallow depth of field, where only the main subject is in focus and everything else is a little blurry. So we'll see if we can simulate that in Premiere Pro. Third, although we can move the camera to our heart's content in Google Earth Studio, there is no movement within the images themselves. They're all just stills. For example, when we get close to Snoqualmie Falls, we expect to see water falling and spray rising, but instead we see a sort of frozen waterfall, which is a little disappointing. So we will experiment with adding some moving elements to these sequences using keying and masking in Premiere. We're also going to experiment with a technique for dealing with a common problem in Google Earth Studio, which you can see here in a sequence where we fly over Puget Sound. Notice the blocky artifacts in the water, which I assume are caused by how Google stitches together images from different satellite views. We'll see what we can do to minimize or at least hide this problem. Let's get started by working on the Snoqualmie Falls sequence. The first thing I want to do is speed up the middle of this clip because I didn't get the timing of the flight quite right for the sequence I'm producing. Rather than going back and re-recording the flight, I can speed up the middle of the clip right here in Premiere. And I could use speed ramping, but often it works just as well to use the razor blade tool to slice out just the part of the clip where you want to change the speed. And then switching back to the arrow tool, right-clicking on the middle section, going to speed duration, and typing in 200, and closing the gap. And now we have a quicker flight out to the falls. Now, before I do any more work, it's a good idea to nest these three segments into a single clip. So I'm going to right-click and go to Nest, and I will call it Fly to Falls Nested. And so it creates a flattened clip. Nesting is a very valuable and powerful tool when you're doing the kind of work that we're going to be doing here. The next thing I want to do is work on the colors. We are going to go to Premiere's Color Workspace, open up Basic Correction. First, I'm going to warm it up a little bit here in the Temperature section and slide this over to warm it up. And I want to darken the blacks a little bit. I'm going to drag them to the left and bring the shadows down as well. Now it's a little candy colored in here. I want a little less saturation, so I'm sliding down the saturation to about 80%. As I scrub through it, it looks richer than it did before. Now, one more thing I want to do here is go to the vignette section, open that up, grab this amount slider, and slide it to the left. And you notice how it darkens the corners. This is a wonderful cinematic look that was introduced to film by Billy Bitzer, who said that he felt a vignette made an image look classier, which it does. Plus, it tends to draw our eye more to the center of the frame. Next, we want to deal with the depth of field because everything here is in sharp focus, and we really just want the middle ground area to be in sharp focus. So we're going to fake that here in Premiere by using layers. So I'm going to grab this, hold down my Option key. By the way, I'm on a Mac, so if you're on a PC, you'll have to translate these keyboard shortcuts for a PC keyboard. So I'm holding down my Option key, dragging upward on the timeline, and it makes a copy of the clip onto the Video 2 track. And now I'm going to add a blur to the bottom clip. So I want to hide the top clip by clicking the little eyeball, and then go to my Effects panel and open up Video Effects and go to Blur and Sharpen and double click on Gaussian Blur. And then grab the blurriness slider and give it not too much of a blur, maybe about 10. Now the whole thing's blurry and we want to have the middle ground in sharp focus. So I'm going to turn back on the top layer and I'm just going to use a very generalized mask by going here to the opacity section and clicking on the oval mask. And there it is. And now we can go grab these handles and drag this thing so it covers most of the middle ground. And I find that the best place for it is a little ways below the center. So I'm going to drag the bottom down a little bit. And then I need to soften the edge of this so that it will be less noticeable. So I go to Mask Feather and drag this number to the right. You see how the feathering increases. And as I scrub through, that looks pretty good. Yeah, especially here at the end. Got the falls in perfect focus. The mountains are going out of focus. However, we've still got a ways to go because there's still no movement within the frame. So this is obviously not a movie. We have to add moving elements, and we do that by putting moving elements on top of the Google still images. The waterfalls are a little challenging, so let's try something easier first by going back to the beginning of this sequence. And what I'd like to do is have some movement in this image. We could add some traffic moving along this street, but an easier thing would be to add some birds flying around here, right? Luckily for us, there are wonderful people who have created and uploaded to YouTube free green screen animations such as this one of birds flying against a green background. So I'm going to target the Video 3 track and make an in point on the timeline, and then go to the end of this fly out. I'm making an out point here on the timeline, and then using overwrite to pop that green screen video on here. Now I need to resize it to my 4K timeline. Typing in 200, now it fills the screen. Next, I need to get rid of the green by going into Video Effects and opening up Keying, scrolling down to Alter Key, double-clicking to apply it, and then here in the Alter Key section of the Effect Controls, I go to this eyedropper and just click in the green area, and voila! The green disappears. And that looks great until we start to fly out. And then we need to have those birds get smaller. So let's find where the fly out begins. Click on the clip and let's make keyframes here for position and scale. There are our keyframes in the mini timeline. And then go to the end of the fly out, where I'm going to click on this vertical position number and drag to the right to pull the birds down in the frame. Then at the same point, I'm going to drag the scale number down to 0 to make the birds get small and disappear as the camera flies out. Next, we're going to work on this waterfall to try to bring some life to it. Happily, I have a video of Snoqualmie Falls that I shot a few years ago. My idea is to superimpose this moving water and spray on top of the still image of the falls from Google Earth. And luckily, my camera was on a tripod, so it's steady footage, which we always prefer, of course, when we're doing compositing. And I've got the playhead lined up with the end of the flight. That's where I want the waterfall effect to begin. So I'm going to put this onto the timeline, and there's my falls. And now I want to isolate the falling water and then scale it and feather it and so on. So I am going to go here to my effect controls, and I'm going to do some masking with the free draw Bezier. So I'm clicking on that. I'm going to isolate this area. I'm going to work first just on the falling water and then do the spray as a separate layer. I'm going to scale it down, move it over there, put it on top. Now I can see that it is fatter and shorter than it needs to be. So I need to distort it. Unfortunately, Premiere does not really have very many tools for distorting shapes. But we'll see what we can do with the scale controls. The first thing to do is uncheck here where it says Uniform Scale. And right away it gets really weird and it's away from where it's supposed to be. So let's move it back, and then let's zoom in a bit here where it says fit. Let's go to 150% and use the scroll bar to find it. Okay, so we've got to make it a lot skinnier. So I'm going to go to the scale width and slide this number to the left. And oh, it flies all over the place whenever we do that. So we got to keep moving it back into position. There we go. That's looking better. Let's get it back over the waterfalls. That's pretty good. Maybe make it a little taller by increasing the scale height. Yeah, okay. Now we need to feather the edge of it. So I'm going to mask feather and increasing the feathering of it. Let's take a look, see if that looks any good. Well, not too bad. I think it'll help if we decrease the opacity a bit. So I'm going up here to where it says opacity, and actually the second section where it says opacity, and taking it down from 100% to maybe 50%. And let's see if that's a little more convincing. Yeah, we just get this sort of hint of movement in there, but we need more spray around the bottom here. So let's do a separate layer for the spray. So once again, I'm going to bring up my video. I'll just drag it over there. Yeah, and it creates a video 4 track. And now I'm going to create a different mask for just the spray area. Let's feather the edge. Scale that down and place it at the bottom of the falls. Now I think we should bring down the opacity to about 75. Good, but I think it's just a tad too bright, so I think we should darken both the waterfall and the spray. Before doing that, let's nest these two clips. So I'm right-clicking and going to nest, call it waterfall and spray nested. Okay, and highlight it. Go to the color workspace. I'm going to grab the whites and pull them down to make it a little less bright. Okay, and now we should have it fade in. Take a look at that. Yeah, I think that fools the eye pretty well. But we also need to think about people's ears. We expect to hear a waterfall when we see a waterfall. So we are going to go to our audio bin and find a waterfall sound. Other sounds we might add would be seagulls, maybe for those birds in the opening, some city sounds when we're close up on the city. And then for when we're flying, I like to use wind. like this whispery wind. Because, you know, it really makes it sound like we're way up in the clouds. So let's throw a bunch of those on the timeline and see how they work. Good. Just throw some music on that and we've got a movie. Now we're going to deal with this sequence where we fly over water. We can see the kind of problems we're going to have with this blocky artifact. It almost looks like a barge out in the middle of Elliott Bay. And then as we back up and then fly over, wow, yeah, look at all this junk that we've got out here. Now, I've seen videos online that show you how you can do a beautiful job of dealing with this kind of thing by going into Blender. It looks terrific, but it also looks like kind of a major operation. So I looked for something kind of quick and dirty I might be able to do to minimize the problem, at least working just in Premiere. So the first thing we have to do is make a copy of the base clip. I'm holding down my Option key, dragging upwards. I'm going to turn off the bottom clip. Now, if this were just a still, we could mask the water and blur it or replace it with something. But this is a moving shot, so masking would be incredibly complex. We'd have to animate the mask. So instead, we're going to use keying. I'm going to my effects panel, and in keying, I'm going to select color key, double-clicking to apply that. Here it is in the effect controls area up here. I go to key color and select the eyedropper, and let's select one of these blues here. Nothing happens because we have to set the color tolerance. So I'm going to grab this slider and start sliding it to the right, and we can see the selection area appearing. And I only want to select as much as I need. So I'm going up to about there. Unfortunately, this is also grabbing a lot of the blues that are here on the land and the building. So unfortunately, those are going to be affected as well. But I think we're just going to have to live with that. The next thing we need to do is reverse the key, because right now it's keying out the water, but we want to do the opposite. We want to keep the water and key out everything else. So we have to add another effect down here under keying called Alpha Adjust. Double clicking on that. Here it is up here. I'm scrolling down and I just go to where it says invert alpha and put a check mark there. And that reverses the key. Now we can turn this base layer back on. Now the next thing we want to do is add a blur to the top layer. So I'm going up to the blur and sharpen section in the effects and adding a Gaussian blur, double clicking, and I'm going to increase the blurriness. I'm going to crank it up to about 100. This does a pretty good job of smoothing out the water. But one problem I'm seeing is that it also adds this dark area around the edges of the frame. I'm not sure why this is happening, but I did find a solution for this. I'm going to undo to get rid of the Gaussian blur, and I'm going to nest this shot. Right-clicking, going to nest. I will call it Puget Sound. Clicking OK. Now I'm going to add the Gaussian blur back in and crank the blurriness up to 100. And there's my blur. And for some reason, there is no darkening around the edges. And I have found that whenever you have problems in Premiere, just try nesting your clips. And sometimes, magically, it solves the problem. Now there's this one area here where we can still see this really dark block. And what I'm thinking we might do is increase the blurriness just at this point. Let's make a keyframe, all right, before we get to that. And then we'll move forward to the worst part of it. And maybe we'll crank up the blur a bit, about 350 or so. And then, you know, once we get over the land, we don't need that blur. So I'm going to shorten the top clip and put a cross dissolve on the end of it and make that cross dissolve about 1 second. Let's render that and see how it looks. Okay, it's far from perfect, but I think it's a lot better than what we started with. If I want to do some more tweaking, I can work on this opening section of the sequence where the city looks kind of misty and blurry, and we can mask it up to the point where the flight starts. So first I'm going to make another copy of the base layer, selecting that new version of the clip. And then in order to draw outside of the frame, I'm going to reduce the view down to 25%, going over here to the opacity section of effect controls, selecting the free draw Bezier, and I'm going to draw a mask around the edges of the city, feather the edge a little more. I can go back to fit. Now I'm going to find where the flight gets started. So it starts there. So that's about as far as I can go without seeing this blocky thing up here. So I'm going to cut this off around there and put a cross dissolve there to fade this sharp section out. I'm going to make that cross dissolve about 20 frames. Now, the very last thing I'd like to do is add a vignette to this whole section. So in order to add a vignette to all three of these versions of the clip, I'm going to use an adjustment layer. So I'm going here to New Item, selecting an adjustment layer, and I'm going to drag that on top of all these clips, extend it out, and then I'm going to select the adjustment layer, go to the color workspace, go down to vignette, and grab the amount slider and slide it into a negative number. And then we can add some music and sound effects and some birds, and I think we've got something pretty good for a very small investment of time and effort. Finally, I'm going to show you some fun things you can do with Google Earth Studio's time of day feature. Here we have a very dramatic flight from Seattle down to the town of Enumclaw near Mount Rainier in the middle of a beautiful sunny day. But Google Earth will allow you to make movies at any time of day, and here's a very dramatic early morning version. And if you've ever actually gone to Mount Rainier from Seattle, you probably left early in the morning. So I think I like the beginning of this, but I would prefer that we get there at midday when it's sunny. Well, we can combine both. Google Earth Studio will allow you to keyframe time, so you can go from one time to another during a movie. Or we can do the same thing right here in Premiere if we record a movie with an identical flight at 2 different times a day. So what I'm going to do is put this morning movie onto video 2 on top of the midday movie, and then do a cross dissolve from one to another. So I'm going to shorten this one, put a cross dissolve on the end of it, and then make that a pretty long cross dissolve. Double clicking, I'm going to enter 4 seconds. So here we go. It's early morning, and then the sun comes up, and it turns into a beautiful bright day by the time we get to Enumclaw. I wanted to bring some extra life and realism to the opening of this sequence, especially a flashing beacon light here on top of the Space Needle. So I've got some video footage of the Space Needle, and I'm going to put that onto the video 2 track right above the Google Earth movie. Then roughly place that in the middle of the frame, and then put an oval mask on it. So that mask is way bigger than what I need, so I've got to shrink it down to a little tiny mask. At this point, it helps to zoom in. I'm going to 400, and then I'm going to reduce the feathering. The default feather is 10. I'm going to reduce it to 2 and bring the mask in nice and tight. And then we need to place it right at the top of the antenna. I'd also like to add a little hint of cars moving around, and I figured perhaps we could put some headlights moving by on this little patch of road right here. So to create that, I am going to make a new item, which will be a color matte. And I'm going to choose just a very light yellow for that and call it headlights. And I'm going to put that onto the video 3 track, and then I have to mask it. I'm going to use the oval mask and shrink it way down to a teeny tiny circle. Reduce the feathering to almost 0, and then we're going to place it and animate it, make it move. I'm going to place it as if it's coming out from behind this tree. So we're going to make a position keyframe for there. And then I'm moving the playhead to where the shot starts to fly out. And then I'm going to move that headlight. I'm changing the position. So let's take a look at that movement. Yeah, that's good. Now we want another headlight right next to it. So I'm going to hold down my Option key, copy the headlight, and now I'm going to move this up a little bit and a little bit to the right. Okay, let's go to the next keyframe and position this again. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, okay. So the lights are pretty subtle, but they add this extra little bit of life to the scene. And then how about we fly an eagle through the shot? Why not? I'm having fun with this, and I hope you do too.